One of my concerns is one of the things that Congress has been so successful at ending around the Constitution is to withhold funds based on, play by my rules, set the drinking age to 18, set the speed limit to 55, something like that. Will not they see, one of the things is your assertion that when they see the power coming that they'll go ahead and pass it anyway to get out of the way. The other thing they could do is kind of knuckle down and play hardball with federal funds, and we see how quickly state legislatures and New Jersey governors lately would buckle under the threat of losing federal jack. And isn't that a concern with efficacy on this?
Sure, it's a concern. It's absolutely a concern. The federal government has gotten the states largely hooked. However, people act a little bit differently when they're making broad structural changes than when they're pursuing particular dollars. In other words, if I can be assured that the same rule applies to everybody and that we're all going to take a certain cut, we're all going to sacrifice a little bit in order to make the country sustainable, we're more likely to go along with that. If that's not the case, if it's a free-for-all, then each one is going to grab for as much as he possibly can. Ultimately, this comes down to the patriotism and the farsightedness of the state legislatures. But, well, maybe not. The other thing to keep in mind is that state lawmakers, like other politicians, like power. And one thing, when you rein in the power of the federal government, you increase your own power. So it does give state legislatures the option of pushing back against the federal government. Many state legislators have the feeling that they're just running agencies of the federal government. They're just running part of the bureaucracy. This is a way in which state legislatures can increase their own power. But it's also a way in which state legislators can put their fingerprint on the future of the country. So, is it possible that most of the state legislatures are not going to agree? Sure. Is it likely they won't agree? Yeah. But should we abandon the cause for that reason? I don't think so. I think that once state legislatures understand what their duty is, most of them will choose to do it.
So there's a lot of different ideas on how to take back our government. A lot of groups are working in different ways. I know Freedom First is trying just to educate as many people as possible about the Constitution, hoping we'll actually be able to elect constitutional representatives. We have some of us in our own Republican Party that are trying to elect bonus members and county chairs to take over the party and have our party return to a constitutional party. Your solution, I'm not hearing the grassroots part of it. I hear the state legislature part, but how do we, as the people, try to hasten that? Do we need to organize in a certain way? What would be your suggestion?
Well, that's where the first committee comes in. The first committee is going to be building, in cooperation with other organizations, a grassroots movement. And I don't think, Ken, I'm at liberty to mention specific organizations, but this is one of the things that we're working on. There are, as you know, a lot of nationwide grassroots organizations out there, and part of our job is to persuade them that this is the way to go. There is absolutely nothing wrong, there is everything right with working for good people for election. There's everything right about public education. I'm not talking about the type that's run by the government. about educating people. But the fact is that history has proven that those things are not sufficient. And so that means that we're going to need a national grassroots movement to put pressure on the state legislatures to take the country back.
Ellen had actually asked something of the question that I was going to ask. But this economic issue having to do with a balanced budget or the other amendment you're mentioning, we have such a horrific apathy from the general public outside of this room that I really believe that getting people to stand up and get involved is extremely critical at this point in time to affect those legislatures. If you could give us some kind of an idea of what you call it, Congress First, or what,
First committee?
first committee, and how it might function, that would give us some kind of a flavor as to how we could help create motivation to make this process work.
This is still in the early stages, okay? But part of the early stages is simply public education. Getting as many people to talk about this sort of thing as possible. We've been mapping out, as you might imagine, preliminary strategy in how to proceed. It includes such things as having conference calls of all organizations already working in the Article 5 area, and there are. For example, the National Taxpayers Union is a huge organization. It's long been committed to using the convention process to adopt a balanced budget amendment. There are other organizations like that. The next step beyond that, we tend to think in concentric circles, going wider and wider. The next step is state legislatures. Is getting as many state legislators educated as possible. We would do this through conference calls, we would do this through YouTube videos, we would do this through personal contact. There's an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a trade organization that consists of conservative and moderate state legislatures throughout the country. They had me author last year a pamphlet. They distribute this pamphlet very widely among state legislatures explaining what Article 5 is. Then there's the issue of getting state lawmakers to introduce applications for a convention for balanced budget or national debt relief amendment. That's usually not a problem. Where the problems occur is that when these proposals for resolutions are being heard in committee, then certain organizations that claim this is going to be a runaway show up at the committee hearings and frighten the legislators by their numbers. That suggests that part of any grassroots strategy is going to be having our people get to the same committee meetings, right, and convincing the legislatures to pass them. Then another component of this, obviously, is the media strategy. Now, the media strategy doesn't sound very grassroots, but in fact it is. It's one of the things I learned in Montana. You know, people who work in the media are people too. They have friends and they have neighbors, and there are always people in the grassroots that know media people. And I'm not talking about national CBS News, but I mean local stations and so forth. So personal contact, grassroots pressure is a way of getting people onto talk shows and onto other sorts of media programs. So that's an example of the sorts of things we're working on. Again, it's fairly early in the process. Another thing that would be a national meeting or rally to draw national media attention to this. I don't know that we want to do this quite yet. I'm not sure we want national media attention before we're ready for it, but there will come a time when that happens. So again, that gives you kind of flavor of the kinds of things that we'll be doing.
I've got a question right here.
Before we do this, is anyone back here who is, yeah, because
I've got a technical question for you, but it has nothing to do with Fort Sumter. How similar do these applications have to be, or to turn it around, can Congress come up with an objection to the need to call a convention by saying, well, you've got 34, but 23 of them, the wording is different than 11 of them?
this is an excellent question, and it's probably the most single important technical question. I mean, you really nailed that one. Let me answer it this way. The convention is basically a task force for solving a problem. If you're in business and your boss comes to you and says, look, Steve, Vince, Dave, I want you guys to serve on a task force to deal with marketing, to increase our marketing efforts. Okay? Note what the boss just said. He gave this convention, this committee, a specific topic to work on, and a specific goal. Your job is to come up with a way to improve our marketing campaign. he did not say, okay, Steve, Vince, and Dave, you guys are a committee for considering anything you want. But he also didn't say, Steve, Vince, and Dave, you're a committee for dealing with our marketing situation, and here's a solution, take it or leave it. He gave them a subject to work on. It's something like the single subject rule that is used in most state legislatures. So the states, in other words, can prescribe a subject. They could, I suppose, create a convention to work on anything the convention wanted, but that's not very likely, and it's certainly not what the founders intended. But on the other hand, the state legislatures are not really permitted to present the convention with a take it or leave it situation. Some, in the 1980s and 1990s especially, we saw many state legislatures pass applications that said something like, we want a balanced budget amendment, and this is the precise amendment we want, and this convention must consider just yes or no on this particular amendment. They can't do that. I don't think those applications can be counted, and I don't think Congress would count them. But on the other hand, the applications don't have to be identical either. And we know this partly because of application practice. I mean, there have been hundreds of applications over many, many years. It is, of course, possible that diehards in Congress could say, we don't care how close they are together. We don't care how much alike they are. We're just not calling it a convention. There is, within modern times, Supreme Court precedent that suggests rather strongly that in that circumstance the court could issue what's called a writ of mandamus, either to Congress or to an officer of Congress, commanding the calling of the convention. Of course, that for Congress to do something like that and ignore the legislatures of 2/3 of the states probably would trigger a constitutional crisis anyway, and it's probably not terribly likely.
Question back here.
You said at one time that 30-something states had called for a balanced budget amendment. How come the number's lower now?
32 states called for a balanced budget amendment, but the number now is only 15. Why so? The basic reason is due to two organizations that have bought into the runaway convention idea. And so what they have done is they've gone to state legislatures, again, who are not very familiar with the law here, and said, hey, you just passed this resolution for a balanced budget amendment. You passed it 10 years ago, and it's still out there, and gee, if that could result in a constitutional convention that could repeal the Bill of Rights and bring back slavery. Literally, I mean, these are some of the charges that have been made, and state legislatures, not seeing any particular resistance to it, have, as a result, passed resolutions that have rescinded all their previous applications. This has happened on a number of different occasions, and that's one reason why grassroots action to show up at these legislative hearings is so important. Now, many of these rescissions, we call them, many of the rescissions of these applications were at a time when it looked like Congress might be getting the situation under control. Remember Graham-Rudman? And then we ran surpluses for a few years during the Clinton era. So at that time it looked less pressing. I doubt if too many rescissions would pass today, especially if there were any resistance to them.
Just a quick follow-up. You said there are two organizations that were at the heart of the movement to derail these. Can you name the perpetrators?
The John Birch Society and Eagle Forum.
So we got a question here.
Probably ought to be the last, maybe one more if it's quick.
Given the examples you brought up of collusion between the different branches of government overcoming constitutional limitations, is there really a prescription for the people to come through a constitutional manner other than electing honorable men to office that will protect the Constitution? Or we pass a balanced budget amendment and 50 years from now the Supreme Court says they didn't mean that kind of balancing. They meant this other kind of balancing, and suddenly the amendment has no force anymore.
Type of balanced budget we have here in Colorado.
What they've done with Tabor, for example, from time to time.
No, what I'm talking about is underfunded public pensions, certificates of participation. They find ways to work around the restriction.
If you've never read Margaret Thatcher's autobiography in 2 volumes, I strongly recommend it. She was one of the most successful political leaders of the 20th century, obviously. But one of the observations that she has in her book is there are no permanent victories in politics. It's always required that people be vigilant. Each generation has its own battle to fight, but those battles are worth fighting. We need to hand over our country to those who come after us, at least as good a position as we got it, and create a situation where they're in a favorable position to fight their own battles. There's always the possibility that something could go wrong sometime in the future. Do nothing and you have the certainty that something will go wrong in the future. Take one more.